All right, everyone. Welcome back to the show. This is Race to the Finish. I'm your host, Carlos. So you've joined us for several episodes so far, and I really hope you enjoyed the first two. And so with this week, I'm bringing on my friend Manny. And you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Manny Brown. I use the pronouns they, them, theirs. I'm super excited to speak with you all tonight, specifically around generational curses and cycles and how they affect certain aspects of the family and kind of diving deeper into what that could look like and how that could change within the next few years. So, yeah.
Wow, so that's a lot.
Yeah.
and that's always a good thing. And generational cycles, I'll admit, is not something that I've really dove into. I'm sure it's around us in some way, but I'm really excited to get to know what the heck you're talking about. And but before we get into all of that, like, I guess, like, let me know, and like let the listeners know, like, how you been, like what's been going on with you.
Yeah, cool. I have been, well, more recently, I've been better than I had been. Like coming out of graduation from undergrad, I've been feeling like down and like kind of lost my sense of purpose. But this past week, I went to a conference that relit the light in me. And so it's just nice feeling like myself again and feeling confident in the path that I'm going, especially heading off to graduate school in San Diego in like 3 weeks and getting all of that together. So right now I'm feeling really great and really bright and lively.
That's so good to hear, especially since, like, leaving college, you get really disconnected with those things, and it's good to hear that you're still connected with
Yeah,
all of that. So
absolutely.
you're
Yes.
excited to go to San Diego, huh?
Very, it is proving to be more difficult finding apartments from like halfway across the country, but
Yeah.
I'm getting there. We're getting closer to the finish line. So,
Hmm.
um, I'm good at procrastinating, so I'm just hoping something falls in my lap.
Same.
Yeah, you
All
know.
right. So generational cycles. From, I guess, from the top, like, what is it? Like, what is it that you're talking about?
So to kind of like describe it, I'm thinking of when you're looking at families, specifically like families of marginalized identities,
Hmm.
why it's so difficult for them to get to a point of success. Specifically, like looking at the large gap between the top 10% and the bottom 90. Why is it so hard? And why, like, for them to reach that top 10? And why is the gap so large?
Okay.
And kind of thinking about the disadvantages that comes with not having access to proper channels in order to break that cycle, and they're just stuck. So kind of
Okay.
just what I would like to do is kind of like analyze, okay, what are some ways that this is happening and how maybe what are some tools we could provide to break them in certain aspects.
Okay. So I guess what I understand from what you're saying is, are we talking about class, like socioeconomic class? Is that what we're really focused on when we're referring to generational cycles, or is it like behavior as well? Like, what, like, you know what I'm saying?
It's really all encompassing.
Okay.
Um yeah, but I mean, we could focus on one and then move to the other. But I think mostly looking at socioeconomic class or status, it would be kind of the first step because that's really the piece that's holding a lot of people back.
Right. And I feel like, well, in a capitalistic economy, money
Yeah.
talks, and
Yep.
people, unfortunately, that's the first gate of approving something. Like, how much does it cost, or what is it costing me? And so I know, I guess, taking a guess at what you're telling me is, let's take a look at poverty, right? And I would talk
Hmm.
to folks around me, about how certain ethnicities, certain racial groups, and all of that have a harder time moving up the socioeconomic class
Hmm.
hierarchy, or whatever you want to call it. And it's because there's a lack of access to certain resources or education and all of that. Well, the reason why I bring up the whole idea of a capitalistic economy is that we're so used to, how can you say, this idea that you have to pull yourself up from your bootstraps, right? This
Mm-hmm.
whole American dream thing. And
Yep.
we know that it works, statistically speaking, for, folks who are white, right? As opposed to folks who are people of color. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And so what would you say to that, to the folks that would say, like, yeah, you should pull yourself up to your bootstraps? Like, how do generational cycles clash or relate to the idea of generational cycles?
So that's the difficult part because a lot of people would think it's more individualistic rather than systemic.
Uh-huh.
And the system is really the one or the factor that's like pushing people down and keeping them in that space. Um, One of the barriers that I think a lot of people don't take into consideration is education,
Hmm.
especially a quality education. And I like often think about myself and how I was privileged enough to go to an affluent university and receive a quality education, which has allowed me to bring knowledge back into my community, and I'll like also allow me to remove myself from that community, and I'm one step ahead um, than a lot of people in my family. So when we're providing access to education, we're providing an opportunity for marginalized identities to break that cycle, but not a lot of
Hmm.
communities have that same channel of access to education. And really thinking about, too, a lot of white people, to be general, come from affluent families. And that's not to say that there aren't those who are struggling, but there are a lot of them that have um, a high class background that come from money. And
Yeah.
it's easier for them to pick themselves back up, whereas other folks it's harder and more difficult because they don't have that same, once again, like that same access.
Right.
So there are a lot of things to take into consideration when thinking about picking oneself back up. Because yes, I do agree that like the individual is responsible, but also the system makes it difficult for any individual that doesn't have like a certain privilege to get there.
Right. Right. And a big issue that I take with, a lot of folks out there who are solely live by that whole principle that we need to pick ourselves up for our bootstraps is because yeah, like you just said, Manny, like, yeah, we do have an obligation to look out for ourselves. That is something that does need to happen. But there's also nothing wrong with recognizing what's holding you back or
Hmm.
the obstacles that may be in your way, and there's nothing wrong with recognizing it as unfair. You know,
Yeah.
and I guess something that I think about too is I think it's important to take into consideration of proportions within our population. And I'm glad that we're talking about this because I'm having flashbacks to a conversation I had with somebody totally different, uh, and we were kind of going back and forth about this whole thing about whether or not this whole idea of victimization, and and I'm on the side of like, no, there's not really so much of this thing called self victimization if you just recognize what is holding ethnic groups back, or entire demographics is just what I meant to say. And he's like, well, no, you just got to have hope. You got to continue to work harder. And it's like, well, the point that you're missing here is that certain people have to work harder as opposed
Hmm.
to other people. And it goes to your point that like a lot of white folks come from money,
Yeah.
and where I'm going with this is that he counteracted that point with, well, there's also a lot of white folks who don't come from money. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he's like, well, if you look at the numbers, and I love when people say that because they're ignoring other numbers too. And
Yeah.
they said, if you look at the numbers, there are more white people in poverty than there are black people in poverty. And I said, oh my God, you don't understand how many people, how many times I've heard that before. It's the percentages of what matter. The percentages, there are more black folks, there are more Latinx folks living in poverty if you take into account the entire population of our
Literally.
demographics as
Yes.
opposed to the entire white population. There are more white folks who come from money than there are white folks who don't have or don't come from money. You see what I'm saying?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so while we may be outnumbered, right? The percents and the proportions, we outnumber that. Unfortunately, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I think this whole idea and you'll see where I'm going with this. This is why I want to bounce this idea off of you. I think this whole idea of pulling ourselves up from our bootstraps and thinking that it's all individual and we don't look out for each other is what's actually perpetuating this whole cycle of um anguish or
Mm-hmm.
lack of opportunity. You see what I'm saying? I really
Yeah.
don't have the answers. I don't have the words. I'm not an expert about this, but
Same.
that's just what I feel. You know, I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think that we've allowed ourselves to believe that it's on us to get where we want to go. But that's not the case at all. And I know, like speaking for myself, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to get where I am, like, or where I'm going in 3 weeks without the support of those, like, on my undergraduate campus or like the friends in my life who've helped cultivate my like
Hmm.
success. So it's taking into account that like no, we can't do it by ourselves, um and we shouldn't have to, but like you said, we've allowed ourselves to believe that it's on us, and that perpetuation of like self success, or not, I don't like, I can't even put it into words, but just, yeah, no, it's not on us at all.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And I think like this whole thing of i- ignoring sociology or ignoring society's role in all of this
Yes.
is almost it's very dangerous, you know, to think that oh we have to go through this alone. You know,
Right.
in fact, if you look at the data, um if we're so how can I make this relevant? So when we're talking about generational cycles, one thing that holds us back is this. I feel like I bring up mental health in like every episode, and I think it's because it's a passion point of mine. But
Yeah.
statistically speaking, the Black and Latinx community are underdiagnosed for mental issues or
Mm-hmm.
mental illnesses, right?
Yeah.
And so because of that, if we look at the criminal justice system, a lot of people who are in jail or prison have a difference in cognition.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 21. And it made everything a lot more clear, right? But if that didn't happen at that exact point in time, I seriously don't know where I would be,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So statistically speaking, if we look at the statistics, we take someone like myself, a Latino. Statistically speaking, I shouldn't be in college. I should be dead or in jail. You know, of
Mm-hmm.
course, I didn't come from an environment that would happen, so I would say I'm an outlier. But I'm also part of another statistic where I suffer from a mental. I don't like calling ADHD a mental illness. It's a mental difference, but I'm not going to get
Mm-hmm.
into that.
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but the thing is that a lot of people who look like me, a lot of people who speak like me, and come from maybe similar backgrounds as me are in jail right now,
Mm-hmm.
and they aren't being treated. And I'm not saying treated like nicely. I'm saying treated with like the proper medical professionals or practices. And how do we expect them to, I guess you could say, better their own lives if they don't have access to those things? I think that's a very extreme example, right? And
Yeah.
so how that all ties in is that there's a reason why we're underdiagnosed when it comes to mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like it comes from the generations before us
Oh
and
yes.
how they had to deal with a lot, right? And you know,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of folks that just got over it or cope with it every single day when they didn't have access to those channels.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a lot of folks that I feel like we don't recognize that
Yes.
didn't make it through, that aren't making it through. And we just kind of look at them as mentally weak or not strong enough to get themselves through the end of the day. And so if we're passing that on to our kids, to our children, I feel like that also perpetuates this whole thing of generational cycles of, you know, holding people back. Is that
Mm.
relevant? You know, everything I
Yeah,
just said, or
extremely. Yes. It made absolute like sense. Especially like thinking about mental illness and how it's not even discussed in like communities of color,
or
unless
even
it's
in the
coming from,
household.
right, unless it's coming from like an educational perspective, like it's not discussed. Um, and unless something very dire happens, it's not even treated. Um, and just thinking about like the piece of like holding each other back, they're not allowing themselves to be vulnerable enough so that they can
Hmm.
um or not even access, but just at least seek out like treatment. um so that they can move forward. And I'm just thinking about like they're just literally just ignoring it and just saying it'll pass or um, anything in between rather than just like hitting it head on because they felt like as if like they're already suffering enough. What's one more thing they need to add to the list?
Right. And what do you so we laid out a lot of examples of how the struggle can go on through generations. I feel like a lot of people don't understand that. Like, what are some other ways that struggle does transfer itself throughout generations?
So I'm like in reflection of preparing for this conversation, I was thinking about my own experience and how I felt kind of pressured to be like the sole glue for the family as I'm moving up within my own like social ladder. Um, like I'm moving all the way across the country, and I still have this sense of responsibility for making sure everyone is okay and able to,
Yeah.
do what they need to do. Um, and like I'll share that like there have been a couple of family emergencies that I've had to completely like shut off everything and be present in that moment. Will I be able to do that in California? No, no, not at all. And I've just been thinking, how have we as a society allowed these cycles to place that, and I hate to call it a burden, but that is what it is, this burden on top of one soul or a couple of soul pieces of the family, and
Hmm.
not allow them to fully engage in their own experiences and their own privilege, and privilege in the sense of they were able to get where they needed to go. And I know for me, once I get where I need, I want to give back to my community and my family. Not many people want to do that. And
Hmm.
it's important to recognize that, but it's also important to recognize that there are those that still want to give back to their community and realize that not everything is peaches and cream once you get to where you need to go. And capitalism creates greed and creates
Yeah.
selfishness. And once you
Well,
get that
greed is
taste,
the engine.
exactly. And once you get a good taste, it's hard to stop eating it.
Yeah. Yeah. And if anything, like, and that's something I feel like we're going to get into this realm, but whatever. But I feel like when it comes to capitalism, we are all born into it, right? It is what we know. I know, myself, I am I lean to socialism. I'm not afraid to admit that. I'm not going
I
to come
agree.
out and say I am a socialist, right? And it comes out to, and as much as I would like to claim that title, to me it comes down to like, well, I was born in this country. I have no idea what it's like to live in a socialist country. I didn't have a
Hmm.
socialist education. I wasn't, you know, all of that was not put into my head as a baby, right? So it's
Hmm.
hard for me to just study socialism for 4 years and just automatically claim it. I feel like that's ignorant. Where I'm going with that is with capitalism, I feel, and what I notice is that we are bred and we are trained to consume. How does capitalism perpetuate itself through through the generations? Like as we become, like our generation becomes a lot more uh aware of these things. Is it a problem or
Oh,
is it something
yes.
good?
No, it's definitely an issue. Um, and one example I'm thinking of is how, um, and once again, to be general, communities of color purchasing like designer brands and spending um, boatloads of money on like these material things,
Uh-huh.
um, and furthering the like capitalist ideals of those companies rather than like giving back to their own communities and uplifting themselves. But
Mm.
I'm really also thinking about too how there's that added pressure. Let's say, because in my experience, there have been a lot of people who have come from the city of Cleveland to the suburb of Warrensville Heights, and seeing the differences that Warrensville Heights like children had versus like the access that they had and how they had to adapt quickly because they did have the latest iPhones, they did wear the latest brands, whereas back
Mhm.
in their other school, none of that was like really prevalent. So how do they navigate that added pressure to be something that they're not necessarily used to? And then getting stuck once you like adding more debt to the family or things like that.
Mm.
Um, And then also thinking about too, with capitalism, I think they're structuring our institutions to make it seem as if we all need a college degree. So we're all thinking, okay, we need to go to college, and then
Yeah.
we're further putting ourselves in debt, which is hard to pay off. Because thousands and thousands of dollars, it's hard to get a job right out of college. Like right now, I have friends who are struggling, figuring out what they want to do because they can't get a job. Even though we know they're highly qualified, it's very difficult. So it's the idea that they have to stay in school, go get a master's or two, before they can even really get into the career field. It's hard.
What I know, oh my God, is the fact that you said or two is so real. Like,
Yeah.
because that's the standard now, is that if you want a good paying job to provide for your family, chances are is that you're going to have to get a master's degree.
Yep.
Even me, like I'm not like yourself where I needed to go off and go on to grad school, right? And
Yeah.
because I thought, hey, I can make it with a bachelor's degree. And so far I'm doing really well for myself. I am. But I do feel the pressure around me. It's like, oh, well, what am I going to do when I'm 30? What am
Hmm.
I going to do like when I'm at 40? Like I think that far ahead of things. And
Yeah.
I like that about myself, but I see it as a curse too, because I give myself a lot of anxiety, because of that. And
Yeah.
I do feel the pressure. It's like, oh, I have to go get a master's degree, right? And so
Yeah.
when it comes down to, if we're going to make it relevant to the whole generational cycles, right? And from what I understand is I feel like there are a lot of things that are passed down throughout generations unintentionally. My
I agree.
parents are immigrants, right? And
Hmm.
they don't know what an American education system is like. It's very different than in El Salvador, right? Where um it's not we don't even go to school. We don't even get like the same level of education for the same amount of years at a time. Like it's not like that. And
Hmm.
so I was on Reddit the other day and someone asked a question. They said, "What do you hate most about being the first child?" And I commented and I said, "Well, I'm pretty much the beta test for the next one."
Yeah.
And and the first example that I think of is education.
Yeah.
My expectation was you need to go to college, you need to graduate and get yourself a good job. All of which are I have nothing wrong with those expectations. The thing is, after graduating, I see a lot of my friends who didn't go to college who are doing as well or better than I am,
Hmm.
with by just going to trade school or maybe not even going to trade school, starting their own thing. And
Yep.
it's like, how come we're not trained to think that way?
Hmm.
How come we're automatically thought how come we're automatically trained to believe that we must go to college and get the top-notch education to get a job that pays as much as somebody that just wants to be an electrician? And there's nothing wrong with those two careers anyways.
Right.
But we're conditioned to think that an electrician is of less value than somebody that goes to get a master's degree in whatever you want. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
to me, I think that's unintentional. Like, what do you say about that? Like, what do you think?
Like, I definitely agree. I think it started off with like, okay, you can go to university, you can do a trade, you could not do anything, just have your high school diploma and like figure it out on your own. But then as time went on, they, meaning like kind of just society, wanted to more structure it more, and that's not how it should be. Because humans in reality, we are not a structured people. We all think differently.
Oh
We
yeah,
all act differently. And that being said, we all shouldn't be forced to go to college. And as I've learned, like college is not for everyone.
yeah.
Um, and people are able to find what works best for them in different channels. Like there have been friends of mine who started in college, dropped out, and are living their best life. There are cousins I have that only have their high school diploma and are like doing really good for themselves. Like I know for me, I would not be able to live on my own right now, or
Mhm.
at least in the last like 2.5 years, I would not have been able to live on my own. Um, and have been able to take care of myself structurally because yeah, I was in school, I was paying tuition, paying an expensive phone bill, and just trying to take care of myself. Like I could barely buy groceries every month because I had to literally stretch it out because work study is only but so much. And that's only my experience. But just thinking about like how did we even get to the point where we wanted to structure education so much that it just doesn't allow flexibility anymore.
Mm-hmm. And I kind of see where you're coming from too. Like, yeah, humans, we are not, um, how can you say? I feel like humans are not meant to be on a conveyor belt or an assembly
Right.
line. And
Yeah.
if we just look at it, I think the easiest way to explain it for time's sake is that humans, we know more about outer space than we do about our own brains. With that, I guess what I wanted to ask you is what are some experiences that you've had with this phenomenon of generational cycles?
Yeah. So, okay. So, as I expressed, I have been able to kind of like break that cycle for my family, but only in little pieces. I'm still breaking it. And I've noticed
Mm-hmm.
that it's caused a lot of tension between myself and other members of my family. Um, and it's not necessarily bad, but there's just a lot of disconnect. They don't understand everything that I'm participating in, or
Mm, I
they're
feel that.
they're not like not as concerned about my well-being because they see that I'm in school, they see that I'm doing all of this activist work and saying all of these motivational things, but I'm still struggling, and like the support of my family could really help. Um, but they just assume that like because I'm here or at this point in my life that like it's all good, but in reality like it's not in
Mm,
in certain aspects. And so what has been tough is allowing myself to be vulnerable and putting myself back in that space and being like, yo, like I need help, like help me, or like talk to me. Why aren't we like actively communicating with each other? Why um does it feel like I have this large disconnect from you all when we used to be so close 4 years ago?
hmm
um and it's been hard like taking a step back and realizing that I'm in a place of privilege now, and like I even have to change the way I talk, the way I act around them because they just won't understand. Like let them say something problematic, like so because my family is very um they're very prejudiced toward other races. Say something
hmm
problematic or use like a term that like is a little iffy when it comes to language, and I'm just automatically like I want to jump in, I want to correct you, but once I start correcting them, it's like here he go or here they go, um, again like using that education to do such and such. But in reality, it's like we have to learn these things. We have to learn how to navigate with people different from ourselves, but we also have to learn how to respect each other's differences and expect that we come from different places, and we can't allow stereotypes to just drive our way of thinking. And that's a
Right.
large problem with a large problem that I see within my family is that they allow stereotypes or the things that other people tell them to drive how they interact with each other as well as other people. As for myself, I'm very different. Whereas I debunk those stereotypes, I get to know individuals, and I don't allow what the media or other people that don't even identify with that identity to create an interpretation for me. I want to learn that on my own,
Yeah.
and that's a part of that disconnect and that gap that's being built between us. And I'm learning to accept that I am different from them in the sense of I know my privilege, but I also know when it's time for me to speak up and address those problematic instances that they have. So
So
just
there's a lot that I want to react to there
yeah,
because you brought up a
it's a lot.
lot of
Yeah.
different things that speak to this whole topic that you wanted to come today with. And you started off by saying that you're working on breaking generational cycles, right? Little by little. But then you followed up with all of these experiences that sound like burdens.
Yeah.
So so I guess the first part to a two-part question is how how do we go about breaking generational cycles? Like what is the solution there? And is that solution in itself a burden? And does that perpetuate the cycle? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and so I think it is a burden. Um, and like as I started with, the first step is like providing yourself access with that education, and being able to get into the realm of capitalism and like create your own capitalist understanding, your own capitalist, um, yeah, like your own capitalist understanding, and just really utilizing capitalism to uplift your own community. Um,
Okay.
and that may look different for everyone. Like my channel of access was through going to university, but or to a university, but it could be something different for other people, like through music or through athletics, things like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be one way. Um, and it also just thinking about in terms of I'm doing this for my family and not for like the entire like black community or the entire LGBT community. Whereas I think it's often interpreted as there are folks who are doing these things for everyone. And that may be the case, but in my experience, or for me, this is for my family and this is for myself.
Hmm.
And like, as much as I advocate for the identities that I hold, I can't allow myself to be the voice for everyone, or at least breaking those cycles for everyone. I have to break my own cycle before I can even touch the other ones.
Yeah. And I think that model of thinking, it exists in so many different places too.
Right.
And this whole idea of like helping other people, right? Before we help ourselves. How could we truly do that if we are not content with ourselves? You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Like if this whole thing of, like the idea of self-love, how can we love somebody else if we don't love ourselves? Or
Hmm.
the idea of helping people. Like if we can't help ourselves, how can we help out somebody else? That pattern of thinking exists in so many different places and it's all in front of us, but we don't see it, And I guess the second thing that, or normally don't see it,
Hmm.
and the second thing that I want to react to too that you said is using capitalism to uplift our communities, right?
Hmm.
Now, we are going back to what you said earlier is that humans, we are very, very different. And uh, I guess you could say the radical in me wants to say it's like, well, we shouldn't use capitalism at all. We're supposed to be revolutionizing our society. We're supposed to be tearing down the establishment and pushing this other agenda, right?
Yeah.
So why should I feel compelled to use this oppressive system for my own benefit and my own community's benefit if at the end of the day inherently capitalism lives on exploitation? Wouldn't
Yeah.
I be exploiting another community? Like why does that make it just? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, so kind of what I'm thinking is that the only way we can dismantle capitalism is through within. Because attacking it from the outside is so tough, especially when, um, and this is really kind of like our generation, which I feel, personally speaking, is much more kind of like tear down capitalism. We need equality. We need, um,
Equity,
essentially a more socialist society,
right.
access for everyone. That's our generation. That's our fight. And attacking it from the outside has been proven difficult when the older generations are like, wait, no, like our money is important. There's no way that we can take that away or like do these things, like thinking about kind of like the student debt conversation or making college free conversation, those things. Just to provide examples, the only way that we can even effectively invite ourselves into the conversations to make change is by getting into those higher positions and actually making the change. And I'll give you
Mhm.
an example. So I had the pleasure of being a part of the NASPA undergraduate fellowship program. And NASPA is a national organization for higher education student affairs. And this specific program allows undergraduate students who are of a minoritized race, identify as LGBTQ, first generation, have some form of a disability, etc., to come together, learn about higher education student affairs, and then it kind of is like a bridge program into higher education student affairs. So when we're thinking about access, that organization is providing access for those identity or people with those identities to understand higher education student affairs, and get into the network of student affairs, which then allows them to get into the university, into the institutions, and create effective change, for the betterment or the better experiences of their students. So that's kind of the framework that I'm coming from, is providing access. And the only way we can do that is by like coming or being within the institution itself and kind of working top down rather than like bottom up.
It's tough to think, because I struggle with that every single day. And it's more like I wrestle with myself in my head, and I'm like, I want to be able to do all these different things, but am I being really responsible with my own ideologies? And what I was thinking about, after everything you just said, is capitalism, according to Marx, and maybe I'm not. Someone will call me out for it if I'm wrong, but is that capitalism is a prelude to socialism. And that it goes to show that, there is truth in that.
Yeah.
And if we as a generation truly believe in this idea of socialism, whether it be democratic socialism or true to the core socialism, that maybe we do need to climb up these ladders and claim the power for ourselves, and then truly make a change. I think the tough part, and like you said earlier on in the episode, though, is that capitalism includes greed.
Yep.
And so if we're going to break this cycle, this generational cycles, if we're really going to truly break it, how do we keep ourselves away from greed? How do we keep our integrity? You see what I'm saying? I feel like that's an important question that we're eventually going to have to ask ourselves.
And I think that's a question that, like you have to ask yourself, how am I going to remain grounded once I get into that higher position and making that 60K salary? And I know for myself, money means nothing to me. Like, it's literally just a means of getting by. I could literally have $100 and give it to someone because they need it, and like be okay living off of nothing for the next week and a half because they needed it. It means absolutely nothing to me. And that's why I'm really reflecting on, okay, how can we allow ourselves to remain grounded? Because not everyone thinks like me, or not everyone is going to be willing to give up their money like me. And it's really like, to keep it individual, it's up to the person, because that greed, it gets to you. And once you get it, it's up to you with how you use it.
Right. Oh my gosh, it's so much to think about.
Yeah.
and I think a lot of it comes from, I'm starting to see it now. I told you before we started recording the episode, is that I never even thought about what generational cycle. In fact, I think I first heard the term from you, eventually when we were talking about an idea for this episode.
Yeah.
And now I think it's starting to come to me, is it's all around us. And it's not up to us as individuals to figure everything out for ourselves. Some people get lucky. Math is a thing, probability is a thing. So of course there's going to be those outliers that do figure out everything for themselves. But to expect that an entire society is going to do that, then how do we break the generational cycles? We're not expected to,
Right.
because it really does link to our market economy.
It does.
To our system. And our system thrives off greed, and it thrives off exploitation. And these generational cycles do need to exist in order for our economy, for our lifestyle to thrive. And wow, everything is making sense.
Full circle.
Yeah, for sure. But let's talk about something a little bit more positive. Is obviously we want to work towards a solution, right? So how do change makers, I would consider you a change maker. I would consider myself a change maker. How do we inspire others in our community to make a change within themselves, but also within their community, right? Leaders create leaders. How do we do that?
So that's a very difficult question to answer. like very difficult. I think for me, how I've been able to do it is by sharing my story.
Hmm.
Because it's it's hard being first gen
Oh
in
yeah.
college, navigating it by yourself. It's very difficult. Like it's just it's hard to answer. I can't even. I think it's something that I would need to reflect on. How can we, you know?
Yeah. I think, and I think that speaks to something too when it comes to recognizing what generational cycles are all about and what they do, is that it's hard to really make it known for other people to recognize it, because it's something that that affects the individual but not so much the entire society, right? I
Yeah.
think the effects on the individual create a common trend within the entire society, right?
Yeah.
And so I guess if we really are going to inspire people, it's like you said, you got to tell your story, but then link it back to what the actual overall phenomena is,
Yeah.
and then getting people to understand that way, like you did me. Like I didn't understand what we were going to get ourselves into now with this episode, but now I understand,
Yeah.
where you're coming from.
And I think also one of the difficult pieces too is that, like, I know if I were to go back to my family and try to explain this, I would have to put it in a language that's easy for them to understand. And that's difficult for me.
Accessible. Yeah.
Right. And that's difficult for me to process because it's like there are certain terms that I like to use that are very descriptive for me, but then it's like I will have to break that term down even more, which makes the conversation last longer, which um, kind of incites more questions for them to ask, which I don't know, it creates um, or makes it more difficult. So it's just, I
It can
think
create a
part of
rift
it
too.
too, right? Part of it too is just taking your time and realizing that um, it may take time for them to understand, so not rushing it and
Hmm.
figuring out the right way to say things. Like you don't have to say everything all at once.
Yeah. And there's a lot of responsibility in ourselves too to recognize that, because like sometimes when we're talking, it happens to me. I'm very guilty of this. Like when I'm talking to somebody about like social issues, right? And they don't get where I'm coming from. And I know that I'm right about what I'm talking about. It could be something very simple as like, say we're talking about like immigration, right? Obviously, it's not
Yeah.
right to be deporting babies back to their home countries to die. Like that's obviously not something right. But then you have the occasional people that come, and say like, well, that baby's going to grow up and take my kid's job. Immediately I'm like, what? And sometimes people should just address it.
Hmm.
Some people just walk away from it. Some people have hope in those types of people to sit through that and to guide them through that whole journey.
Yeah.
A lot of the times that person's not me. That person was me for years.
Hmm.
And then it just came down to it where I just adopted this mindset where it's like, if we're going to be talking about human rights are not debatable. You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
Like families should not be separated.
Hmm.
Shouldn't be judged on what you identify as. You know what I'm saying? Like those
Or
things
who
are
you're an
not
ally for.
exactly. Like those things are not debatable. You
Yeah.
know, and that to me is like, I don't know. You know
Hmm.
what I'm saying?
And it's also like very emotionally taxing
Yes,
when you're sitting and trying to explain these things. And it could create frustration for you if you, um, or if they're not if it's not clicking as quick as you would like it to with them. And just like being patient, because patience is a very hard thing to have, especially when having these difficult conversations.
for sure.
So it's,
I think a lot of it has to do with the space too.
oh yeah.
Because
If
like
the
say
space isn't
say
provided,
right, like it's a lot different when you establish a safe space, right, with like certain
hmm
expectations where you're going to be able to have this conversation without somebody using a slur or punching you in the face, like and compared to as when you're in the workplace and you're trying to do your work, but then somebody is being a bigot, right, and no one's telling them anything. And then immediately it gets to you, it's like, okay, listen, I'm not here to be talking about this. Like, this is not the right place, the right time. And immediately you get put in the back of your feet, right? The heels of your feet, and you're in defense mode, fight or flight mode, like literally.
hmm
And so that to me is like, it comes down to identity. Like how are you
Yes.
looked at? Like how are you perceived? And
Yes.
how do you perceive yourself also?
Mm-hmm.
And it determines all of those things. So I guess one of the last points that I want to get to that I thought about when it comes to generational cycles is, and I don't want to get explicit with this, because I don't want to put out a content warning or anything, but generational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I've seen discussed all over social media. Something discussed with my family, something discussed with my friends.
Mm-hmm.
That certain things that our parents go through become ingrained in their behavior, right? And so eventually our parents went on to have us, and those experiences that they experienced that stuck within their memory but don't exist in our brains. We didn't go
Mm-hmm.
through it. Eventually, you know, those actions that are caused by those memories within themselves reflect themselves within the way that we are raised, right?
Yeah.
And so, an example, the reason I bring that up is when you were talking about your family, right? And
Yeah.
how sometimes they don't understand why you do, get yourself involved with things that the way that you do, like with activism and education and
Mm-hmm.
what you study, right? And it comes down to, well, maybe they don't understand. Well, I guess the way that I relate to that too is I, I've had my family tell me you shouldn't be talking about this on Facebook. You shouldn't be posting about politics on about all this stuff. Like, and it's not even just a mere suggestion. Like, I've had arguments with my family about this, and
Yeah.
it took me the longest time to understand. Like, why are you coming at my neck for?
Yeah.
This is something I care about. Like, obviously, people are like suffering because of these issues. Like, I have a voice. People listen to what I have to say, so of course I'm going to use it.
Mm-hmm.
But then I had to really sit down and think about it. It's like, well, where are they coming from? And they come from a war-torn country where if you say the wrong thing, you're going to get a bullet in your head. And these are all things that they have lived, that they've experienced. And so I kind of had to take a step back and reflect and try to understand where they're coming from. And while things may not be as extreme here, where they certainly have the capacity to, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
On a grand scale, I still have to come and think about that, and I feel like that's a way that I've broken that generational cycle little by little is by coming to that understanding. I'm able to navigate myself in a
Yeah.
way that my parents can accept, but also in a way that I can accept.
I think it just that barrier is tough. Is the toughest part, but there are ways to break them, and there are ways to still feel connected and involved with your family without feeling that burden. Um, it's just you have to figure it out and what works best for you.
Hmm.
Um, I know for me, I had to realize that yeah, I am different in the sense that well, not only in my character, but just also in my experiences and the things that I want to pursue. But does that necessarily mean that I have to cut all ties off with my family and just be a whole completely different person that doesn't even want to recognize them? No,
Hmm.
I still want to be able to help them in the ways that I've been able to help myself. And keeping myself grounded in the fact that I'm doing all of this work, yes, to enhance my identities, but also to uplift my family. Um, like, I know when I was writing my personal statements for grad school, a lot of what I was discussing was how I was a first generation student and how a lot of my success um, wasn't based off of me being intentional about my academics because like that wasn't my strong suit, but mostly keeping in mind that my family wanted this for me and my family needed this from me.
Hmm.
So finding what works best for you and finding out how you can utilize that that so-called burden of the cycle or of breaking the cycle to continue to be who you authentically want to be and need to be in order to get to a place of change.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, this is so much to take in, but I think the most relieving part of it is if you read a lot. right, and you study a lot and pay attention to your surroundings, you can find links between what you're saying, right, and the importance of the overall picture. And what I mean by that is everything you just said, it's so relieving to hear because it's true, right? To live authentically it is extremely important, extremely, right? Because then if we mask ourselves every day, right, pretending to be something else, then we are not living authentically, you know. Um, I know I was just talking a little bit about philosophy earlier, about existentialism, and my favorite existentialist is Simone de Beauvoir, and you know, she describes the most important virtue is authenticity,
Mm.
and to live authentically, and to not live authentically means, that we don't necessarily enjoy everything in between. And the
Mm-hmm.
example that she uses is if you want to write a book, right, to actually enjoy the book that you wrote, you must have enjoyed. And I'm probably butchering this, but like I said, someone will call me out on it. So, but you have to enjoy the process in between. You actually have to like writing in order for you to like the book at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So I think it takes a certain person, and tell me if I'm wrong, please. It takes a
Mm-hmm.
certain person to have the capacity to recognize generational cycles and but also to enjoy, to an extent, unraveling those things and breaking the generational cycles, because we are human beings. We not all of us have the same capacity to do things as somebody else, no matter how much we like to think it. Some
Yeah.
people have different conditions. Some people have come from different backgrounds or maybe can't deal with the same things in the same way. And it takes people to recognize that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Completely agree with everything you just said.
Awesome.
Completely
So
agree.
wrapping up the episode, you probably recognize this from did I just say repinize?
I don't even
Recognize.
know.
It certainly felt like I said it. But anyways, you probably recognize this from last year when, Race to the Finish was just a baby.
Mhm.
I like to ask every guest, if you could say one thing to the world, what would it be? Uh I guess I'm asking you that now. So if you could say one thing to the world, what would it be?
Don't allow the added pressures of society to rule your life. It may seem difficult at the time, but in reality, you create your own understanding of the world and your own perception of your belonging in the world and in society. So take into account that your experience matters, the work that you are doing matters, and your understanding of how the world works matters. And that these cycles, though like they suck and it may be very difficult to dismantle, will not continue to happen once we realize we have so much power than they allow us to think we have. And I think with that, I am done.
Awesome. Yeah, that
Yeah.
was really powerful. And then if you listen to the first episode, and you will probably listen to the second episode, I asked the guest, one last question. So now instead of asking one last question is two. The second thing is a lot more simple. Do you have any shout outs? Where can we follow you? Do you have anything to say to anyone that you want to say? Like, the floor is yours.
Yeah, cool. I actually want to thank all of the friends that I made this past weekend at the Dungy Leadership Institute. I don't think I would have been able to effectively conceptualize this idea without the knowledge that they have given me this past week. I also want to thank my sister and my dad for being my biggest supporters, as well as my best friends, Gurneet, Zakia, Dwight, Brittany, Mercedes, Tyra, etc. You all know who you are. My socials are pretty much the same, Mannie, but with a V and then three E's at the end. I'm sure you can find it in the description. But yeah, like follow me, listen to my rants when I go off at certain times, get into my fashion world if you are into that. And yeah, be your authentic self with me because I will always be my authentic self with you.
Awesome. All right, listeners, you can follow them on their social media. Just look up the episode descriptions. I stress it every single time, so because I want my community to read the episode descriptions because that's where you can find, a lot more about our guests and a lot more about the show. So thank you everyone for joining the show. Thank you, Mannie, for joining the show. I'm sure that
Absolutely.
you'll be on in the future again, just how you were on for the second time,
Yes.
but let's hope for more. All right,
Absolutely.
everyone. You know where you can find us. Watch us on YouTube, Facebook, Apple, Spotify, Google, Podbean, all of that. So if you ever want to see us on other channels, just please shoot me an email, shoot me a message, and we can work that out. All right, everyone. See you next week. Bye-bye.